The office felt too small, too cramped, as if the walls were closing in on Lori Griffin. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the stale coffee smell lingered in the air. It was a typical Monday morning in Cleveland, Ohio, but it didn't feel like a fresh start. Not to Lori. She sat at her desk, her fingers poised above the keyboard, but the words didn't come. Not because she didn't know what to do, but because every keystroke felt like an exercise in futility. Lori had worked in this office for 8 years, and for 8 years she had been just another invisible cog in the machine. The other office workers walked past her desk every day, heads held high, talking loudly about their weekend plans or the latest gossip. Lori, however, sat quietly, her head bent over her paperwork, her eyes fixed on the screen in front of her. She didn't mind the silence. In fact, she preferred it. But over time, that silence had become more than just a comfort. It had become a problem. Her boss, Steve, had made it clear more than once that Lori's quiet nature was a liability. She didn't speak up enough in meetings. She didn't network with clients. She didn't assert herself when things went wrong. Lori knew all of this, but it didn't come naturally to her. She had always been this way, reserved, introspective, more of a listener than a talker. But here, in this office, in this world of loud voices and big personalities, Lori's silence had made her easy to overlook. And today, she was about to be reminded just how true that was. It was just after lunch when Steve called her into his office. Lori had always dreaded these moments, the quiet ones, when Steve would ask her to do something she didn't fully understand, or when he would point out something she hadn't done right. She stood up from her desk slowly, her chair squeaking as she pushed it back. As she walked across the floor, the sound of her footsteps echoed in the empty office, each step a reminder of how alone she felt here. Alone despite being surrounded by people. Steve's office was small, cluttered with paperwork and framed pictures of his family. He looked up as she entered, giving her a tight smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. His office smelled faintly of cologne and cheap aftershave. Lori stood there for a moment, waiting for him to speak. He motioned for her to sit. "Lori, I've been meaning to talk to you about something," Steve began, his voice flat. There was no warmth in his tone, no kindness. It wasn't the first time he'd called her into his office for this kind of conversation. Lori's stomach churned, the familiar knot forming in the pit of her belly. "Sure, Steve. What's on your mind?" she asked, her voice soft, almost too soft. She could hear the hesitation in her own words. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in front of him, looking at her over the rim of his glasses. "You've been with us for a long time now, Lori. You've done good work. But we need more from you. We need you to step up, to take more initiative. You're too quiet, too reserved. We need someone who can take charge, who can speak up in meetings, who can sell our services to clients. Right now, you're just in the background." Lori's heart sank. She had heard it before. Her silence was a problem, a weakness. She wasn't assertive enough, wasn't outspoken enough, wasn't enough. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The words were stuck in her throat, lodged there like a rock, and she didn't know how to get them out. "I'm afraid we're going to have to let you go, Lori," Steve continued, the words coming faster now, as if he were just getting them out of the way. "Your position's been eliminated. It's just not working out." Lori felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Let go? She had been fired before, but never like this. There had been no warning, no conversation about her performance, no indication that she wasn't doing her job. She had done everything they asked of her, kept the office running smoothly, handled the details that nobody else wanted to touch. And yet, here she was, standing in front of Steve, a casualty of her own quiet nature. "Don't take it personally, Lori," Steve added quickly, as if trying to soften the blow. "It's just business. We need someone who's more dynamic, more vocal." Her breath caught in her chest, and for a moment, everything seemed to blur. The walls of the office, the papers on the desk, Steve's face. All of it faded into the background as she focused on the ringing in her ears. She had no words, no comeback, no argument, just silence. "Are you okay?" Steve asked, his voice a bit too sharp now, as if he were unsure whether to offer sympathy or just get this over with. Lori stood up slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered her things. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice steady, though she could feel the sting of the words. She didn't understand. Not really. But she wasn't about to argue. She never did. She just gathered her things, slung her bag over her shoulder, and turned to leave. As she walked out of the office, she heard Steve muttering something about HR and the details of her severance package, but it all seemed distant now, irrelevant. All she could think about was the weight of those words. Too quiet. Not enough. It wasn't the first time she'd been made to feel small because of her silence. But this time, it felt different. This time, it was more than just a hurtful comment or a passing judgment. It was the reason she was losing everything she'd worked for. The elevator ride down was a blur. Lori stood there, the doors closing in front of her, her reflection staring back at her from the polished metal. She hardly recognized herself. The woman in the reflection seemed smaller somehow. She felt the ache of loss, not just for the job, but for the years she had spent in this building, invisible and unheard. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped out and into the cold Cleveland air, the wind biting her skin, the chill of reality settling in. She didn't look back. There was nothing left to look at. The parking lot was almost empty, save for a few cars. Lori stood by her old, beat-up sedan for a moment, staring at the parking ticket on the windshield. The humiliation of it all hit her hard, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself a moment of grief. They fired me, she thought, and it stung more than she cared to admit. But then, something shifted, a small spark deep inside her. She stood up straighter, wiping away a tear before anyone could see. Lori Griffin was quiet, yes, but she was also stronger than she had ever given herself credit for. And as she sat behind the wheel of her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel, she made a silent promise to herself. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The drive home was long. Lori's car hummed steadily as she drove through the quiet streets of Cleveland, the city she had called home for most of her life. She didn't feel like listening to the radio, didn't want to hear the noise of the world just yet. All she wanted was silence, the kind of silence that spoke louder than words, the kind that had always been her refuge. She took a left onto her street, a quiet, tree-lined block that felt like a different world from the cold corporate building she had just walked out of. Her house wasn't much, but it was hers, small, cozy, tucked in between two much larger houses, the kind of home that had always felt like a place of quiet comfort, a safe haven. As she pulled into the driveway, Lori sat in the car for a moment, staring at her front door. She wasn't sure what to feel anymore. Anger, relief, fear, they all tangled together in her chest. But there was one feeling that rose above the rest: confusion. She had always been a quiet person, and she had never thought of it as something that could keep her from succeeding. In fact, she had prided herself on her ability to listen, to observe, to stay out of the way while quietly doing her work. She didn't need the spotlight. She didn't need the attention. All she wanted was to make a difference, to be valuable. And yet, here she was, with nothing to show for it but a pink slip and a heart full of unanswered questions. She finally pushed open the car door and stepped out, feeling the cool breeze on her face. As she walked up to the front porch, she saw her mother sitting in her favorite rocking chair on the front porch, the soft creaking of the chair almost in rhythm with Lori's own heartbeat. Her mother, Eleanor, was an older woman now, with silver hair and weathered hands. She had always been a woman of few words, but when she spoke, you listened. She had raised Lori with the kind of quiet strength that only came from years of living with purpose and resilience. "Hey, Mom," Lori said softly, her voice almost a whisper. As she sat down beside her mother, Eleanor looked up from her knitting, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Hey there, sweetie. How was work?" Lori hesitated for a moment, unsure how to explain everything that had happened in the last few hours. She had expected to feel angry, to let the frustration pour out of her like a storm, but instead, she felt empty. She swallowed hard, pushing the lump in her throat down. "I got fired, Mom. They said I was too quiet." Eleanor didn't flinch, didn't ask any questions, just nodded and continued knitting, the soft click of the needles filling the silence between them. Lori couldn't help but feel a wave of gratitude for her mother's quiet presence. Eleanor had never been one for grand speeches or emotional outbursts. She spoke through her actions, through the way she lived her life. Always steady, always calm, always there when Lori needed her the most. Lori exhaled deeply, feeling a weight lift just by saying the words out loud. "They said I don't speak up enough, that I don't take initiative, that I don't fit in." Eleanor stopped knitting for a moment, setting the needles down in her lap. She looked at Lori, her gray eyes sharp but soft with understanding. "And what do you think?" Lori sighed, staring down at her hands. She had no answers, no clever comeback. She didn't know what to think. "I don't know. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm just not cut out for that kind of work. I've never been the kind of person who makes a lot of noise, Mom. I don't know how to sell myself the way others do." Eleanor's hands rested gently on Lori's, the touch warm and steady. "Lori, you've always been someone who listens. You notice things that others don't. You've always been that way, and it's not a flaw. It's a gift." Lori looked up, meeting her mother's gaze. "A gift?" she asked, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "Yes, a gift," Eleanor said firmly. "You don't need to be loud to make a difference. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who don't shout, the ones who quietly observe, who see things others don't, who build things without needing recognition. You've always had that strength. It's in you." Lori's chest tightened, a mix of emotions rushing through her. She had spent so many years thinking her silence was something to be ashamed of. She had spent so many years trying to fit into a world that didn't understand her, that didn't value the quiet strength she carried. But now, sitting here with her mother, she was beginning to see things differently. Maybe her silence wasn't something that needed to be fixed. Maybe it was something she could use to her advantage. "What am I supposed to do now?" Lori whispered, the uncertainty still gnawing at her. Eleanor leaned back in the chair, looking out at the street, her gaze far away as if searching for something in the distance. "You're going to do what you've always done. You're going to listen. You're going to see things others don't. And then you're going to take a chance. A big one." Lori's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Eleanor turned to her, her voice quiet but sure. "You've always been good at fixing things. And you've always been good with people, Lori. Maybe it's time you start something of your own. Maybe it's time to stop waiting for someone else to give you a chance. Create your own chance." The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time that day, Lori felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that came with big dreams and grand plans. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of hope that whispered softly, telling her that even though things were uncertain, she had everything she needed to move forward. Lori stayed silent for a while, letting her mother's words settle in her mind. She wasn't sure where this new path would lead, but for the first time, she realized that she didn't need all the answers right away. She didn't need to be loud or perfect or anything other than who she was. She just needed to take that first step. The next morning, Lori woke up early, before the sun had even risen. The world was still and quiet, just like her. She sat at her kitchen table, sipping coffee, staring out the window at the world outside. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let this setback define her. Lori had always thought her silence was something to hide, but now she was beginning to understand that it was something to embrace. It was her strength, her power. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to use that power to build something new, something that would change her life forever. She grabbed her phone, opened the real estate app she had been secretly browsing for months, and began scrolling. There was something inside her, something deep and quiet, telling her that now was the time to stop playing small, the time to make her own noise. She clicked on a listing, her fingers steady as she tapped the screen. The first step had been taken. The next few days passed in a blur, a quiet storm of new beginnings and old doubts. Lori spent hours researching real estate, flipping through listings, studying maps of Cleveland, and jotting down notes. It wasn't the kind of work that felt glamorous or exciting. It was quiet, methodical, almost soothing in its predictability. But it felt right. Her mind, usually clouded with the aftershocks of being let go, began to clear. There was something comforting about the act of planning, of mapping out the pieces of a future she hadn't yet realized. She found herself waking up earlier each day, the weight of her decision pressing against her in the most reassuring way. Her mother, Eleanor, had always been one to approach challenges with patience. She never rushed into things. She observed. She waited. Lori realized she had inherited that same patience, that quiet strength. She didn't need to rush. She didn't need to hurry into the next thing, even though every part of her wanted to escape the nagging feeling of fear. Instead, she took her time, letting the world unfold at its own pace, letting her decisions come from a place of calm. A week after her firing, Lori took a drive through the neighborhoods she had studied online. Her heart raced as she pulled into a street lined with old buildings, their facades weathered but sturdy, standing tall as if they were waiting for something. One particular building caught her eye, a former bakery, its windows cracked but the structure sound. She parked her car and stepped out, the air cool against her skin, the weight of the moment almost too heavy to carry. She walked around the building slowly, the scent of old brick and neglected wood in the air. The building spoke to her in a way that felt strange yet familiar. This was the kind of space that could hold potential. The kind of space that, with a little work, could turn into something more than just walls and floors. She could see it already: new paint, restored windows, and tenants who would walk through the doors, looking for a new beginning just like she was. Lori found herself standing in front of the building for longer than she realized. She imagined what it could look like, what it could mean. She was no longer the woman she had been just a few weeks ago. The quiet office manager, too afraid to make waves, too afraid to take up space. She was someone else now. Someone who had stood up to her fears and chosen to build something with the very quiet that had once made her feel invisible. She glanced at the for sale sign posted on the building's front door, the number boldly printed in black. She reached into her bag, pulling out her phone, her hands steady despite the racing thoughts in her mind. With a deep breath, she dialed the number. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. "Hello." Lori's heart skipped a beat. "Hi, this is Lori Griffin. I'm calling about the building on West 12th Street. I'm interested in purchasing it." The man on the other end of the line was quick to respond, a professional tone in his voice. "Sure, I can get some information over to you. The building is priced at $250,000, and it needs some work, but it's in a good location. Are you looking to invest in commercial real estate?" Lori's pulse quickened. She hadn't planned on diving straight into a conversation about the details, but here she was. "Yes, I'm interested in turning it into a mixed-use space, some office space, maybe a cafe or a small retail shop. Something that brings life to the area." There was a pause on the other end, then the sound of papers rustling. "It's definitely got potential. If you're serious, I can set up a viewing for you. Would you like to meet tomorrow?" Lori felt a slight tremor in her hands as she put the phone to her ear. "Yes, tomorrow works fine. I'll be there." As she hung up, she stood outside the building for a few moments longer, letting the reality of what she was about to do settle in. She had taken the first step. She had spoken up, and now there was no turning back. She could feel it deep inside. This was what she had been meant to do. The next morning, Lori drove back to the building, her nerves a bundle of quiet energy. The day was overcast, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. But Lori didn't mind. She had always loved the rain, the way it made everything feel fresh and new. She parked in front of the building and stepped out, her shoes tapping lightly against the wet pavement. A man in his mid-40s greeted her at the door, a real estate agent who had already opened the building's front door. He smiled, extending his hand. "Lori Griffin?" he asked, his voice warm. "That's me," she replied, shaking his hand. "I'm here to take a look." The agent led her through the front door into a dark, musty space. Lori could smell the remnants of old flour, the echoes of a time when this place had been filled with the scent of fresh bread and pastries. The floors creaked beneath her feet as she walked through the empty rooms, her footsteps the only sound in the vast, open space. It was as if the building itself were waiting for her to bring it back to life. "You can see the bones are still solid," the agent said, gesturing to the exposed brick walls and high ceilings. "It needs a lot of work, but with the right vision, it could be something great." Lori nodded, taking in the space. She saw the possibilities, the light filtering through the dirty windows, the open floor plan that could be divided into various workspaces, the potential for something unique. But it wasn't just the building that caught her attention. It was the feeling she got when she stood there. This was hers for the taking. She had spent so long waiting for someone to give her a chance. And now here she was, standing in a place that was waiting for her vision. "I think I see." The agent smiled. "Well, if you're serious, we can start the process right away. The owner is motivated to sell." Lori's heart raced, but she didn't hesitate. "I'm serious. Let's move forward." After a few more minutes of walking through the space, Lori stepped outside into the rain. Her clothes were damp, but it didn't matter. Her mind was already 1,000 miles ahead, envisioning the changes she would make, the work she would put into this building to turn it into something special. She walked back to her car, her hands trembling but her spirit stronger than it had ever been. She had taken a chance. She had spoken up. And now, Lori Griffin was on the path to something she never thought possible. She had taken her first step out of the darkness, and she wasn't going to stop now. The next few weeks blurred together, the days merging into one long stream of decisions, phone calls, and paperwork. Lori found herself immersed in the process of purchasing the building, her quiet determination pushing her through every obstacle that arose. There were moments when the weight of it all felt too heavy to carry, when the doubts crept in, telling her she wasn't equipped to do this, that she was in over her head. But every time that voice spoke, she silenced it with the same steady resolve that had gotten her this far. The first challenge was financing. As someone who had never taken a big risk before, Lori's savings weren't enough to cover the full cost of the property. She had always been cautious with money, keeping it tucked away for a rainy day. But this wasn't a rainy day. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when everything she had silently dreamed of could come to life. She spent hours at the bank, meeting with loan officers who raised their eyebrows at her quiet demeanor, but didn't question her when they saw the plans she had for the building. There were no grand pitches, no slick presentations, just a woman with a vision, quiet but determined, and a plan to turn an old bakery into something new. At times, Lori felt like she was living in a dream. She had always been the behind-the-scenes person, the one who quietly made sure everything ran smoothly, but never the one who took the lead. And now here she was, on the brink of making one of the most significant decisions of her life, and all she could do was keep moving forward, step by quiet step. The loan was approved after a few tense meetings, and soon Lori found herself in possession of the building. It was hers, but owning it didn't make it any less daunting. The space was empty, cold, and full of forgotten things, the remnants of a past life. The floors were covered in dust, the walls peeling, the windows cracked. It wasn't glamorous, but Lori had never been one for glamour. She was used to the work that went unnoticed, the kind that required patience and persistence. The first thing she did was hire a crew of contractors to begin renovations. She didn't know much about construction, but she had learned enough in the last few weeks to be able to make informed decisions. She spent hours walking through the building with the foreman, discussing plans for the layout, the color of the walls, the type of flooring she wanted to install. Her decisions were practical, simple, and direct. She wanted a clean, welcoming space, a place that felt lived in, that made people want to stay. She also started brainstorming ideas for the businesses that could occupy the building. The idea of mixed-use space felt right: offices on the second floor, retail shops on the ground floor. The possibilities were endless, but Lori didn't want to rush into it. She knew that the right tenants would come, but only if the space felt like a place where people could thrive. One of her first decisions was to build a small cafe in the corner of the first floor, a place where people could stop by, grab a coffee, and have a quiet moment. Lori knew that it would take time for the building to come to life, but she could already picture it. The tables lined up by the windows, the soft hum of conversation, the smell of fresh coffee filling the air. It was everything she had ever wanted to create. A space that felt welcoming, that had purpose and meaning. As the weeks went on, Lori's confidence grew. Every time she walked through the building, seeing the progress, feeling the transformation taking shape, she felt a quiet pride that no one else could see but her. This was her creation, her work, her future. But it wasn't just the building that was changing. Lori was changing too. She was learning to speak up, to make decisions, to take charge of her life in ways she had never thought possible. There was a strength inside her that had always been there, buried beneath the layers of self-doubt and fear. And now it was coming to the surface. The work wasn't easy. There were setbacks, delays in the renovation process, issues with permits, unexpected expenses. There were days when Lori felt like she was losing control, when the weight of it all felt too much to bear. But every time the stress threatened to overwhelm her, she would take a step back, find a quiet corner in the building, and breathe. She knew that nothing worth having came without its challenges. By the end of the second month, the first floor of the building was almost complete. The cafe space was nearly ready, the floors polished, the walls freshly painted in a warm, neutral tone. Lori stood in the middle of the room, her hands resting on her hips as she surveyed the space. It was beginning to feel like the place she had envisioned, the place she had quietly dreamed about for so long. Lori's phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from her mother. "How's the building coming along?" She smiled, her fingers moving to type a quick reply. "It's coming along. Slowly, but it's happening." Her mother's reply came almost instantly. "I'm proud of you, Lori. Keep going." The words were simple, but they meant everything. Lori knew her mother didn't need to say much. She never had. Her support was in the way she showed up every day, in the way she quietly believed in Lori, even when Lori had doubts. As Lori left the building that evening, she paused at the entrance, looking out over the street. The world outside was bustling, but here, in this small space she was creating, everything felt still. Everything felt possible. She thought back to the days when she had worked in the office, when she had been just a quiet figure in the background, unnoticed and unimportant. Those days felt so far away now. Lori had taken a leap, and although she didn't know exactly where it would lead, she knew she was building something that was all her own, something that mattered. It wasn't just the building that was changing. It was her life. Lori Griffin wasn't just another quiet woman anymore. She was a woman who had taken control, who had faced the silence and made it work for her. And as she locked the door behind her that evening, she realized that she was no longer the same person who had walked in a few months ago. She was stronger. She was braver. She was someone who could build from nothing. The weeks following the completion of the cafe were both grueling and gratifying. The days seemed to stretch on forever as Lori continued to work tirelessly on the renovations. The cafe had finally opened its doors to the public, a modest little shop with rustic tables, a carefully curated selection of pastries, and freshly brewed coffee that filled the air with a warm, inviting scent. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and in that, it felt like the most beautiful thing she'd ever done. Still, the work was far from over. Lori had poured herself into the cafe, but she also had the rest of the building to manage. The second-floor office spaces needed final touches. She had begun reaching out to potential tenants, mostly small businesses and startups, but the process was slower than she had anticipated. For every call that showed promise, there were two that ended in disappointment. The economy wasn't great, and finding the right tenants, the ones who would understand the vision she had for the space, was proving more difficult than she had imagined. The first weeks were lonely, quieter than she had ever anticipated. The mornings were spent overseeing contractors, answering emails, and coordinating the flow of the cafe. By afternoon, when the sun began to dip low in the sky, Lori would find herself walking through the empty halls of the building, checking on the spaces that were still unfilled. The empty rooms echoed back at her, a constant reminder that the work wasn't finished. At times, the silence in the building was deafening. She had grown used to the hum of the cafe, the clinking of mugs and the low murmur of conversations. But when the cafe closed at night and she was alone in the building, the quiet settled in like a heavy weight. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was a reminder that there was still so much to do, and it was all on her shoulders. Lori had always been okay with solitude. It was how she'd grown up. Her mother was a woman of few words, and their home had always been a place of quiet, of small moments and muted conversations. But this was different. The loneliness of running the business, of managing a building that only partially felt alive, gnawed at her in a way she hadn't expected. One evening, after another long day of waiting for tenants to come through, Lori found herself sitting at one of the tables in the cafe. The shop had closed, and the space was empty except for the faint remnants of the day's activity. The smudged coffee cups, the uneaten pastries left behind, the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the corner. She had cleaned up earlier, but now she just sat there, staring out the window at the empty street. It wasn't the kind of loneliness she had felt when she had worked in the office, when she had been surrounded by people but still felt invisible. This was a different kind of isolation. This was the loneliness of building something from scratch, of carving out a future and wondering if anyone would ever recognize the work she had put into it. She heard the soft sound of the door opening, and she looked up. A man in his late 30s stepped inside, dressed casually in a navy blue hoodie and jeans. His eyes swept the room briefly before settling on Lori. "Sorry to bother you," he said, his voice warm and a little sheepish. "I'm looking for a place to rent. I saw the sign outside." Lori stood up quickly, brushing the crumbs from her hands. She hadn't expected someone to walk in at this hour, but she was grateful for the distraction. "You're interested in renting space here?" He nodded, stepping further into the cafe. "I'm thinking about starting a small web design business, and I need somewhere affordable but decent. I prefer to be in a place like this, you know? Somewhere that has character. This place feels right." Lori felt a flicker of hope rise inside her. This could be it, she thought. She showed him the second-floor office space, and as they walked through the rooms, she could see his eyes light up. He asked thoughtful questions about the space and the building's potential, and by the end of the tour, he was filling out a rental application. That night, after he left, Lori stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at the empty hallway. The sound of his footsteps still lingered in her ears, like a promise. She had taken another step forward, another small victory that felt larger than the rest. It was a sign that the building was coming to life, slowly but surely. It was proof that her vision wasn't just a dream. But as she stood there, alone once again, she couldn't shake the feeling of solitude that clung to her. Yes, the cafe was buzzing with customers every morning, and yes, the first tenant had just signed a lease. But she couldn't ignore the long stretches of silence between those moments. There was still so much work to do, and Lori had to face the reality that no matter how much she had built, the journey wasn't over yet. The next morning, she arrived at the building earlier than usual, the sky still a pale blue. She spent the day cleaning and preparing the second-floor offices for the new tenant, taking care to make the space feel welcoming. As she worked, Lori couldn't help but reflect on the long journey that had brought her here. From the moment she had been fired, everything had felt uncertain. She had been lost, unsure of her next step. But now, as she wiped down the windows of the empty office, she realized something. The silence had always been there, but now it didn't feel quite as oppressive. She had learned to work through it, to use it, to make it her strength. The isolation she had once feared was becoming a source of empowerment. It was in the silence that Lori had found clarity. It was in the stillness that she had discovered her strength. And as she worked alone in that quiet building, she felt something shift inside her. She wasn't just building a physical space anymore. She was building a life that was hers and hers alone. As she locked up for the night, Lori stood outside the building, looking at the lights glowing softly from the windows. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was hers. The work, the effort, the solitude, it was all part of the journey. And for the first time, Lori knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The weeks following the signing of the first lease moved at a pace that both thrilled and exhausted Lori. The new tenant, Noah, was a web designer. A quiet, creative type with an easy smile and a calm demeanor. His presence in the building gave Lori a sense of purpose she hadn't realized she needed. The second floor, which had once echoed with emptiness, now felt alive with possibility. Noah was a gentle soul, keeping to himself for the most part, and that suited Lori just fine. She didn't need much fanfare, didn't want to be constantly in the spotlight. The real shift, however, came when other tenants began to show interest. Lori had always envisioned her building as a community, a space for people to create, collaborate, and grow. Noah's presence proved that the vision was starting to take shape. The idea of having multiple tenants in the building, each bringing something different to the table, was beginning to feel more tangible. One evening, after closing up the cafe, Lori sat in her office. Her laptop opened before her as she scanned through a list of potential tenants. There were a couple of artists who were interested in studio space, and even a small marketing firm. She wasn't quite sure how to handle it all yet. Handling contracts, managing the space, and coordinating with contractors, but she was learning quickly. Every phone call, every meeting was a step forward. And for the first time in a long time, Lori felt like she was finally stepping into something bigger than herself. The building was becoming more than just a project. It was her future. She felt a sense of ownership that she had never experienced before. Each time someone new walked through the door, each time a new lease was signed, it felt like a small victory, a quiet triumph, hidden beneath the surface of her everyday life. But there were still challenges. Noah was the first tenant, and it was easy to be excited about the building's potential when it was just one person. But managing more tenants, ensuring the space stayed clean, maintaining the cafe, and juggling the endless paperwork, it was all becoming more than Lori had anticipated. There were days when she felt like she was barely keeping her head above water. One afternoon, as Lori walked through the building, checking on the renovations in the hallway, she bumped into Mrs. Weaver, an elderly woman who lived 2 doors down from the building. Mrs. Weaver had lived in the neighborhood for decades and was always watching out for things, which, in Lori's experience, was both a blessing and a curse. "Oh, Lori," Mrs. Weaver said, her voice warm but tinged with concern. "I've been meaning to talk to you about the building. I hear you're filling it up with all kinds of businesses now." Lori nodded, offering a smile. "Yes, we're starting to get some tenants. It's coming together." Mrs. Weaver narrowed her eyes slightly. "I just want to make sure the building's in good hands, that's all. The neighborhood's been changing a lot lately. Some of these businesses, well, I don't know. I just want to make sure it's the right kind of people moving in." Lori could feel her patience thinning, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd always respected Mrs. Weaver's opinion, but lately, the old woman's concerns seemed to border on judgment. She had heard similar comments from other longtime residents, too. Change, even positive change, wasn't always welcome in neighborhoods like this one. People didn't like the unfamiliar. "We're being very selective about who we bring in, Mrs. Weaver," Lori said, keeping her voice steady. "Only businesses that will fit in with the community here. We want to make sure we're improving the area, not just filling space." Mrs. Weaver softened a bit, her gaze lingering on Lori for a moment longer. "I just don't want to see this place turn into one of those trendy spots that forgets about the people who've been here all these years. You know?" Lori nodded. She understood. It was a balancing act, keeping the building's authenticity while also introducing new energy to the neighborhood. But she had come to a decision in that moment. She wouldn't let fear dictate her choices. She wouldn't let the voices of doubt, whether they came from the outside or within, stop her from doing what felt right. "I understand, Mrs. Weaver," Lori said with a genuine smile. "And I promise, we'll make sure the building stays true to its roots." After Mrs. Weaver left, Lori stood in the hallway for a moment, letting the silence of the building wash over her. It wasn't just about the building anymore. It was about everything she had been working toward. The quiet, persistent strength that had kept her going when everything seemed uncertain. Lori wasn't just creating a physical space. She was creating a legacy. The next day, she received an email from a local artist named Amanda, who had heard about the building and was interested in renting a studio space. The email was short but enthusiastic, and the subject line was enough to make Lori's heart skip a beat. Studio inquiry. Your building sounds like the perfect place. Lori quickly replied, setting up a meeting to show Amanda the available space on the 3rd floor. She had already begun visualizing how the artist's studio would fit into the building's dynamic, light, airy, and creative. But Lori wasn't sure whether this would be the right fit for Amanda. She had met with enough prospective tenants to know that the right people needed to come together in the right way. The meeting went better than she could have hoped. Amanda was warm, passionate about her art, and instantly fell in love with the space. They discussed the lease terms, the kind of work she would be doing, and how the studio would fit within the overall vision for the building. Lori felt a quiet sense of triumph as they shook hands and finalized the lease. Amanda was moving in. Later that day, Lori walked through the building, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. She took a moment to reflect on how far she had come. It had been less than 6 months since she had walked away from her job, from the life that had felt so suffocating, so limiting. Now, the building was full of possibilities, of people who believed in together to create something meaningful. She stepped into the cafe, her home base, where the familiar hum of conversation and the clink of coffee cups greeted her. Noah was sitting at one of the tables, his laptop open in front of him as he worked. Lori smiled and waved as she walked over to his table. "How's everything going?" she asked. Noah looked up, a small smile on his face. "Good, really good. I've got a couple of new projects lined up, and this space is perfect. I don't think I could have found a better place to work." Lori felt a rush of gratitude and relief. She had been so uncertain at first, so unsure of whether people would see the potential in her building the way she had. But hearing Noah speak with such confidence, such enthusiasm, reassured her that she was on the right path. "I'm glad to hear that," Lori said, her voice soft but full of meaning. "That's exactly what I wanted, to create a space where people can grow and do what they love." The two exchanged a few more words before Lori stepped behind the counter to prepare a fresh cup of coffee. As she moved around the cafe, arranging pastries and wiping down the counters, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time, Lori Griffin felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. It had been a few months since Lori had signed the lease for the first tenant, Noah. The cafe was thriving. The building was beginning to fill with tenants, and Lori had settled into a rhythm. Her days were long, filled with overseeing the building's renovations, meeting with potential tenants, and ensuring the cafe ran smoothly. But with each passing day, the quiet loneliness she had felt in the early days began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of pride in what she had created. But not everyone saw it that way. The old neighborhood was changing, and not everyone was pleased about it. Lori knew this. She had heard the whispers, felt the disapproval from a few of the longtime residents, and seen the frowns on the faces of those who had lived in Cleveland for decades. They called it gentrification, and though Lori didn't quite understand the full implications of the term, she felt the weight of it in the sideways glances and veiled comments. She had tried to explain her vision to some of the locals, the ones who had lived in this neighborhood for as long as she had, but it always felt like she was speaking a language they couldn't hear. She had tried to make it clear from the beginning. This wasn't about pushing people out. This wasn't about changing the neighborhood in a way that erased its history or its people. This was about giving the neighborhood new life, new opportunities. But not everyone was ready to hear it. One afternoon, while she was sitting in the cafe, reviewing some paperwork, Lori saw a familiar face. It was Mrs. Weaver again. The elderly woman had always been a fixture in the neighborhood, a constant presence on the street, and she had a reputation for knowing everything about everyone. Lori had always respected Mrs. Weaver, but lately, she felt a growing tension between them. Mrs. Weaver stood by the counter, looking at the pastries with a skeptical frown. Lori didn't say anything at first, but when Mrs. Weaver finally turned to her, her expression was one of concern, or perhaps frustration. "Lori," she began, her voice soft but tinged with disapproval. "I've been hearing some things around here. You've been filling up that building of yours with all sorts of businesses, haven't you?" Lori set down the papers she was holding and looked up at Mrs. Weaver, offering a calm smile. "Yes, Mrs. Weaver. I've been working hard to turn the building into a place where people can live and work. A place where the community can come together." Mrs. Weaver's lips pressed into a thin line. "A place for people who don't belong here, you mean? I've been hearing about the kinds of businesses you're bringing in. Web designers, artists, fancy coffee shops. What about the folks who've lived here for years, Lori? What about them?" Lori felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had heard this before, the fear, the judgment. She had always known that some people wouldn't welcome change, but she hadn't expected it to feel this heavy. "I'm not trying to push anyone out, Mrs. Weaver," she said softly. "I want to bring something good to this neighborhood, something that can grow with it." Mrs. Weaver's eyes narrowed, and she shook her head. "I don't know about that. You can't just bring in all these outsiders and expect everything to stay the same. People around here don't care about your fancy cafes or your web designers. They want real businesses, businesses that take care of the people who have always lived here." Lori's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "That's exactly why I'm trying to do this, Mrs. Weaver. I want to create opportunities for people here. The businesses in my building, whether they're artists or designers, they're not just coming in to take from the community. They're investing in it." Mrs. Weaver's expression softened, but the doubt was still there. "You can't just change things like that. You'll see. People around here won't stand for it." With that, Mrs. Weaver turned and left the cafe, the bell above the door chiming softly as she disappeared into the street. Lori stood there for a moment, her heart heavy with the weight of the conversation. She had tried, truly tried, to explain her vision to Mrs. Weaver, but it felt like nothing she said would be enough. The tension between the old guard and the new was palpable, and no matter how many good intentions Lori had, it wasn't going to be enough for some people. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to set, Lori sat in her office, her fingers running over the papers in front of her. She had been so focused on the building, so wrapped up in the process of creating something new, that she hadn't considered how much resistance she would face. She had expected challenges, but this was different. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about something deeper. It was about the very identity of the neighborhood. Lori had always been the quiet type, the one who stayed in the background, never asking for much, never pushing for attention. But now, the quiet that had once served her was beginning to feel like a burden. She had always been content to let others take the lead, to let others speak up. But now, as she faced the mounting pressure and resistance from those who didn't understand her vision, Lori realized that the time had come to speak up. The time had come to stand her ground. Her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking her thoughts. She picked it up and saw a message from Noah, her first tenant. "Hey, Lori, I just wanted to let you know that I've been talking to a couple of people, and they're interested in renting some space in the building. I think this could be the break we need." Lori's heart lifted at the message. This is it, she thought. This is the moment. She couldn't afford to let the negative voices hold her back. There were people who believed in her vision. There were people who saw the potential in the building, in the space she was creating. The neighborhood was changing, but change didn't have to mean the end. It could mean growth, opportunity, and a future for everyone who wanted to be a part of it. She typed a quick reply to Noah, her fingers moving with newfound determination. "Thanks for the update, Noah. Let's keep this momentum going. This is only the beginning." As the days went on, Lori pushed forward, determined to prove that she wasn't just building a space for artists or web designers, but for the entire community. She reached out to local businesses, to the people who had been skeptical of her plan, and invited them to see the building for themselves. She made it clear that her goal was not to change the neighborhood, but to make it better for everyone, regardless of their background or occupation. Slowly, but surely, the conversations began to shift. It wasn't easy. The whispers didn't stop. The resistance didn't disappear. But Lori was no longer afraid of the silence. She had learned to use it as her strength. And as she stood in the cafe, watching her tenants begin to make the building their own, Lori felt the weight of the past few months lift off her shoulders. She wasn't just creating a building. She was creating a legacy. And for the first time, she realized that she wasn't just doing it for herself. She was doing it for the community. As the weeks slipped by, the energy in the building changed. It wasn't just the tenants. The cafe had taken on a new life as well. More people were coming in, not just for coffee but for the experience. The warmth of the space, the sense of community that Lori had quietly built, began to spread through the neighborhood. Despite the murmurs from those still skeptical of her efforts, Lori started to see the fruits of her labor. But even as things were moving forward, there was still a lingering fear at the back of her mind. It had become clear that the challenges weren't just about filling empty spaces or making sure everything was running smoothly. The real challenge, the one she hadn't fully anticipated, was managing the emotional toll of creating something new in a community that wasn't always ready for change. Lori had always been the quiet one, the one who didn't stir the pot, who stayed in the background. She had gotten used to working in the shadows, letting others take the spotlight. But now, she was forced to take on a new role, one that required her to stand firm, to claim her space in a world that had always been loud, dominant, and unforgiving. She wasn't just managing a building anymore. She was fighting for its future and for her own. The tipping point came one cold afternoon in November. Lori had been working late, her eyes tired from reviewing contracts and planning the next phase of renovations. The cafe had closed, and she was just about to lock up when her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and saw that it was a number she didn't recognize. For a moment, she considered letting it go to voicemail, but something told her to pick up. "Hello, Lori Griffin?" The voice on the other end was sharp, businesslike. "Yes, this is she. Who's this?" "This is Jeff Larson from the City Zoning Board. We've received complaints about your building. There's been some concern from residents about the type of businesses you're bringing into the area." Lori's stomach tightened, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. "I've done everything by the book. The building's zoning is commercial. The businesses are all legal." "We're aware of that," Jeff said, his tone still cold. "But there are concerns about parking, traffic, and the impact on the neighborhood. We've received multiple complaints, and we're going to have to conduct a formal review." Lori's heart pounded in her chest. She had been waiting for something like this to happen, but hearing it out loud made it feel all the more real. "What does this mean for the tenants?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "It means a hold on any future leases and possibly an injunction on your current tenants until we can assess the situation further. If the complaints are valid, you could be looking at a lengthy process to get approval." Lori felt her chest constrict. She had worked so hard to get to this point, to create a place for people to live and work, and now it felt like it was all unraveling before her eyes. But she knew she couldn't give up. She wouldn't. "Look, Jeff," Lori said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I'm committed to making sure this building fits into the community. If there's an issue, I'll work to resolve it. But I need you to understand, this is not just a business to me. It's a place where people are finding opportunity, a place where this neighborhood can grow. We've already started making changes, and I won't let it fall apart." There was a long pause on the other end, and for a moment Lori thought he had hung up. But then he spoke again, his voice softer this time. "I'm just doing my job, Lori. I understand what you're trying to do here, but this is a process. A long one." Lori felt the weight of his words. "I'll make sure the review goes smoothly," she said, her voice resolute. "But I won't let this building be taken from the community. Not without a fight." "Understood," Jeff replied, and the line went dead. Lori stood there for a moment, her hands still gripping the phone. She had known it wouldn't be easy, but hearing it laid out like that felt like a punch to the gut. She had always been the quiet one, the one who stayed out of the way. But now it was clear that silence wasn't an option. She would have to speak up. She would have to fight for what she had built. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, paperwork, and phone calls. Lori reached out to her tenants to inform them of the situation and reassure them that she was doing everything she could to resolve the issue. She spent hours meeting with city officials, local business owners, and even the residents who had raised concerns. She listened to their worries, their fears, and their frustrations. She didn't defend herself. She didn't try to make excuses. She just listened. But as the days turned into weeks, Lori began to realize that listening wasn't enough anymore. She had been quiet for so long, and it had served her well in some ways. But this was different. This was her fight, and if she wanted to protect what she had built, she would have to step up and speak her truth. The day of the zoning board meeting arrived, and Lori stood outside the building, her hands trembling at her sides. She had never been one for public speaking. In fact, she avoided it at all costs. But this was her chance to make her voice heard. She couldn't let fear hold her back anymore. Inside the room, the atmosphere was tense. The room was filled with residents, business owners, and city officials, all waiting for the meeting to begin. Lori sat at the back, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had prepared a speech, but as the meeting began, her mind went blank. When her name was finally called, Lori stood slowly, feeling the eyes of the room on her. She took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice soft at first, but gaining strength with each word. "My name is Lori Griffin, and I am the owner of the building on West 12th Street. I know there have been concerns about the businesses that have moved in, but I want you to know that my intention has never been to harm this neighborhood. I've lived here most of my life, and I believe in the potential of this community. I believe that by bringing in businesses that align with the neighborhood's values, we can all grow together." Lori paused for a moment, glancing at the faces in the crowd. Some of them looked skeptical, others indifferent. But she could feel the weight of her words, and she knew that this moment was hers to shape. "I didn't start this project to make a quick profit," she continued, her voice steady. "I started it because I believe that change doesn't have to mean destruction. Change can bring new opportunities, new life, and new hope. I'm committed to making sure that the businesses in my building contribute to the community in meaningful ways, and I'll do whatever it takes to make that happen." There was a long pause after she finished speaking. Lori's heart raced, but she didn't flinch. She had said what needed to be said. She had stood up, not just for her building, but for everything she believed in. And for the first time in a long time, Lori felt the weight of her silence lift. She had claimed her space, her voice, her future. As she sat back down, she realized something. Fear would always be there, but it no longer controlled her. She had faced it head-on, and she had come out stronger on the other side. The following weeks after the zoning meeting were a whirlwind of phone calls, emails, and even more meetings. The intensity of the situation had forced Lori to stretch herself in ways she hadn't expected. Each time she thought the tension might ease, another obstacle presented itself. But despite all of this, something had shifted. She wasn't the same woman who had timidly walked into the cafe months ago, unsure of her place in the world. No, Lori Griffin had found her voice, and it was louder than she ever imagined. Her confidence grew with each victory, even the small ones. The zoning board had approved her building's permits, and the tenants who had once questioned whether this was the right place to start their businesses were now happy with the space. The cafe was buzzing with regular customers, and new businesses were starting to see the value in the neighborhood. Lori felt the pulse of life returning to the building, slowly but surely. It was starting to feel like home, but the real test came when she received a call that would change everything. It was from a well-known commercial real estate firm, one that had been a significant player in Cleveland's downtown district for years. Lori had heard of them before. They were powerful, influential, and had the kind of resources that most people could only dream of. When she saw the company's name pop up on her phone screen, her heart skipped a beat. "Lori Griffin?" The voice on the other end of the line asked. The tone was smooth, calculated, but polite. "This is she," Lori replied, feeling her pulse quicken. "My name is Kyle Weston. I'm calling on behalf of Weston and Company. Real estate. I've been made aware of your building on West 12th Street, and we're interested in purchasing it. Lori's mind raced. She'd known this day might come, but the thought of actually selling the building that she had worked so hard to create, was almost unfathomable. You're interested in purchasing? She repeated, trying to steady her voice. Why? We've been looking to expand our portfolio, and your building fits the criteria we've been seeking, Kyle said smoothly. It's in an up-and-coming neighborhood, and with a little investment, it could be quite profitable. We're prepared to offer you a generous sum for it. I believe you'll find the terms to your liking. Lori felt a cold wave rush over her. She knew what this meant. It was an offer she couldn't refuse, not in the traditional sense. The amount of money they were offering was enough to make her rethink everything she had worked for. It would solve all her financial problems, take the weight off her shoulders, and leave her free to pursue something else. But something inside her resisted. She had spent too much time, too much energy, too many sleepless nights building this. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the pride, the satisfaction of knowing she had created something from the ground up. She couldn't let it go just because someone waved a check in front of her. I appreciate the offer, Kyle, she said, forcing herself to sound calm. But I'm not interested in selling. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment Lori thought he might hang up. But Kyle didn't. Instead, he continued in a tone that was both persuasive and cool. I understand, he said slowly, but I believe you're underestimating the opportunity here. With our backing, we can help you expand the building, add even more businesses, and make this an anchor in the community. Think of the potential, Lori. This isn't just about selling. It's about growing. Lori's mind spun. She had always been cautious with money, careful with her decision. Defeat. It wasn't just a real estate transaction for her. It was a testament to everything she had overcome, everything she had worked for. I've put too much into this, Kyle, Lori said, her voice firm now, as she found her resolve. I'm not selling. Not now, not ever. There was a brief silence before Kyle spoke again. I respect your decision, Lori, but I want you to know that the offer still stands. If you change your mind, give me a call. Lori hung up the phone, the weight of the conversation settling heavily in her chest. She had stood her ground, but part of her wondered if she had just made a huge mistake. Had she let fear cloud her judgment? Was she too attached to the building to see the bigger picture? But as she sat there in the silence of her office, something inside her clicked. No, this wasn't about the money. It wasn't about expanding for the sake of growth. It was about maintaining the integrity of what she had built. It was about standing up for the quiet dream she had nurtured for so long. She wasn't going to sell out. She was going to see this through. The next day, Lori met with her tenants in the cafe. The space was filled with the hum of conversation as she brought them together to discuss the future of the building. Noah, Amanda, and a couple of other tenants joined her at the table. They all looked to her with anticipation, as if they were waiting for her to tell them what was next. I've been offered a substantial amount of money for the building, Lori began, looking each of them in the eye. But I want to make one thing clear. This place, this community isn't for sale. Not to anyone. The room went quiet as her words hung in the air. For a moment, Lori thought they might question her decision, might wonder why she was turning down such a good offer. But instead, they nodded, some with knowing smiles. I believe in what you're doing here, Lori, Noah said, and I'm not going anywhere. Amanda chimed in, neither am I. This place is something special. It's not just a building. It's a home. Lori felt her heart swell with pride. These were her people. This was her community, and she wasn't going to let it go without a fight. Thank you, Lori said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. I'm glad you're all with me on this. We're in this together. As she looked around the table at her tenants, Lori felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She had made the right choice. She wasn't just building a building. She was building a legacy. And no matter what happened next, she would see it through, not just for herself, but for all the people who believed in her and in the vision she had quietly created. Lori had faced her fear. She had owned her power. And now, she was ready to fight for the future of the building, for the community, and for the quiet strength that had brought her this far. The days after the zoning board meeting had been a blur. Lori had done her best to put the looming offer from Weston and Company out of her mind, focusing instead on what mattered most, the people in her building, the ones who had believed in her vision from the beginning. But despite her best efforts, the phone call from Kyle Weston kept creeping back into her thoughts. It was hard not to think about the potential of their offer, the money, the expansion, the ease it would bring to her life. On paper, it made perfect sense. She could sell the building, pocket the windfall, and live comfortably for the rest of her life. It was the kind of deal most people would jump at. But Lori was no longer most people. She had worked too hard, fought too many silent battles, and watched too many things slowly fall into place to simply walk away now. When she made the decision to reject the offer, a quiet strength filled her. She wasn't just standing up for her building. She was standing up for herself. The decision had been hard, but the more she thought about it, the more certain she became. Her journey wasn't just about money or business deals. It was about creating something authentic, a place that felt alive with purpose, where people could come together, and where quiet strength had a chance to thrive. Her first tenant, Noah, had been the first to really recognize what Lori was trying to do. As she walked through the building now, seeing the various spaces being filled, Lori felt a sense of ownership that was deeper than just the deed to the property. It was the people inside it, the lives they were building together, that truly gave her strength. As the weeks turned into months, Lori's reputation in the community began to shift. People started to recognize her not as the quiet woman who had started from nothing, but as someone who had created something of value. Her building wasn't just a real estate venture. It had become a cornerstone of change in the neighborhood. Yet, despite the success of her tenants, Lori never allowed herself to forget the quiet moments that had built her. The hours spent alone, in the stillness of the building, had been the foundation for everything. She wasn't just building physical walls. She was building a sanctuary, a refuge for those who needed it. She was building herself too. One morning, Lori arrived at the building to find that a few new tenants had signed their leases, filling up more of the vacant office spaces. She smiled to herself, feeling a quiet sense of pride. The building was filling up, just as she had hoped. There were still challenges, of course. Construction was ongoing in the rear of the building, and there were always small issues to address. But for the most part, things were coming together. Lori walked into the cafe and poured herself a cup of coffee. She could hear the faint murmur of voices from the tenants in the hallway, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the weight of isolation. There was life in the building. There was noise, yes, but it was the kind of noise that signified progress, not disruption. She felt a connection to each person who passed through the doors, and in a way, she knew they felt the same way about the space she had created. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up and saw an email from Noah. "Hey Lori, I have a potential client who's looking for office space. They're interested in one of the second-floor units. Can we talk about a lease agreement?" Lori's heart lifted. This was the kind of opportunity she had hoped for. The building was becoming not just a space for people to rent, but a space for people to grow, collaborate, and build something that would outlast her. She quickly replied, arranging a meeting with Noah and the potential client for the next day. The day of the meeting arrived, and as Lori sat at the small table in the cafe, she couldn't help but think back to the days when this had all seemed like a distant dream. She had been fired, told she wasn't enough, told her silence was a liability. And yet, here she was, with a building full of tenants, a cafe that brought the community together, and an opportunity to take things even further. Noah arrived first, followed shortly by the client. A young woman in her 30s, sharp-eyed and eager. They exchanged pleasantries, and as they sat down at the table, Lori felt a sense of calm wash over her. She had done this before, navigating meetings, negotiating terms, but this time it felt different. She wasn't just the quiet observer. She was the one in charge. They discussed the lease details, the terms, and what the young woman needed in terms of office space. Lori could feel the energy shifting in the room. This wasn't just a business transaction. This was a moment of validation. This was Lori's chance to show not just her tenants, but herself, that she had built something worth believing in. When the meeting wrapped up, the client agreed to move forward. Lori's heart swelled with pride. This wasn't just another office space being filled. This was proof that her vision was taking shape, that her quiet work had value. As the client left, Lori shook her hand and smiled. "Welcome to the building," she said quietly. Noah clapped Lori on the back as they walked out of the cafe together. "You did it," he said. "I knew you would." Lori smiled, but it wasn't the first time someone had told her she'd succeed. The difference now was that she believed it. She had built this step by step. She had faced the fears, the doubts, the resistance, and come out stronger. And her building, was proof of that. Later that evening, as she walked through the empty hallways, Lori paused in the center of the building, her hands resting on her hips. The space felt different now. It wasn't just a structure of brick and mortar. It was a reflection of her journey, her strength, her quiet power. She glanced around at the rooms, the spaces that had once been vacant and silent. Now they were filled with life. People were working, creating, and building. It wasn't just about the building itself anymore. It was about what had been built within it. Lori had created a community, a place where people could find success, a place where she could find her own. As Lori locked the doors and turned off the lights, she knew one thing for sure. She had made the right choice. She hadn't sold out. She hadn't let fear take the wheel. She had stood her ground, fought for what she believed in, and now her building was more than just a place to work. It was a symbol of resilience, of quiet strength, and of the power of never giving up. She was no longer the woman who had been overlooked and underestimated. She was the woman who had built something real, something lasting. And as she stepped out into the cool night air, Lori Griffin knew that the journey was just beginning.